Chapter 1. The Wyrdstone Bloom. The tunnels beneath Mordheim were older than memory, older even than the corruption that now clung to the city like a festering wound. Down in the deepest reaches, where even the vermin feared to tread, the air was a choking miasma of rot and unseen vapors. Here, the darkness was not merely an absence of light, it was a tangible thing, thick and coiling, slithering through the ancient stone veins of the Undercity. Bregu Limphond moved cautiously, his hunched form nearly swallowed by the gloom. His misshapen frame, one shoulder grotesquely higher than the other, his spine twisted like a knotted rope, shambled forward on crooked legs. His bulbous, weeping eye twitched incessantly as he sniffed the damp air, his gnarled fingers twitching on the haft of a rusted pickaxe. Beneath the rags he called clothes, his flesh was marked with weeping sores, purple veins spiderwebbing across his bloated skin. He was a prospector of sorts, a scavenger of wyrdstone, that cursed green crystal vomited forth by the comet that had shattered Mordheim. It promised riches to those foolish or desperate enough to seek it, and Bregu was both. He muttered to himself, voice a wet whisper, "Deeper, deeper, smell it, yes, smell it, sweet." The walls around him trembled faintly, a constant, low hum vibrating through the stones. Every so often the pitch of the hum would rise, a keening sound like 1,000 shrieking rats, but only for a heartbeat before subsiding again. Bregu barely noticed. His whole being was attuned to the scent, the electric tang of wyrdstone that buzzed against his ruined senses. He rounded a corner, shuffling past a collapsed arch where skeletal remains grinned at him from within the rubble. A blackened helmet sat askew atop a shattered skull, ribs clawing upward as if pleading for salvation that never came. Bregu spat at it and hobbled on. The tunnel opened into a cavern, if it could be called that. It was a rupture in the earth, a gash lined with broken foundations and twisted beams, crumbling frescoes smeared with mildew and gore. The air was warmer here, disturbingly so, and it pulsed faintly, like the labored breathing of a dying beast. And there, at the heart of the cavern, it bloomed. The wyrdstone. It jutted from the ground like a cancerous flower, its crystals a sickly green shot through with veins of pulsating black. The shards twisted upward in spiraling arcs, radiating a nauseating light that made the shadows dance and slither as if alive. Around its base, the ground was warped and cracked, jagged like broken teeth, oozing a viscous, stinking fluid that hissed and steamed as it ate into the rock. Bregu gasped, his ruined face splitting into a grin of awe and hunger. His eye bulged wider, trembling with ecstasy. Here was more wyrdstone than he had ever seen in his miserable life, a fortune beyond imagining. Enough to buy him not only survival, but power, status, maybe even revenge against all those who had spat on him. He stumbled forward, drawn like a moth to flame. Each step closer, the hum grew louder, a thrumming chorus inside his skull. His nose bled freely, thick black rivulets that streaked down his chin, but he paid it no mind. As he approached, something moved. The ground near the bloom heaved like the surface of a diseased pond, and from it erupted a mass of twitching, pallid limbs, a thing half-birthed from the wyrdstone's corruption, a mockery of life, writhing and gurgling in the dust. Its body was an abomination, eyeless, mouthless, little more than a mass of flesh with stunted arms clawing at the air. Its flesh steamed where the wyrdstone's fumes touched it, peeling back in wet pink strip. Bregu recoiled, the stench of it a physical blow. The thing convulsed and split apart, disgorging a flood of tiny, squirming maggot things that scattered into the cracks with a wet, slithering sound. The prospector retched, thick gobs of bile splattering at his feet. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stared again at the bloom. Its light had grown brighter, almost hypnotic. He heard whispers now, soft as a lover's breath, promising him power, beauty, acceptance. Promises he knew were lies, but lies sweet enough to believe. He stumbled the last few steps forward, his pickaxe dragging behind him with a metallic screech. One trembling hand reached out, fingers splayed, to touch the wyrdstone. The moment his skin made contact, reality tore open. Baridon screamed, a high, keening sound that echoed off the cavern walls as visions invaded his mind. He saw himself crowned king of a city made of bone and crystal, courted by demons in silken robes. He saw himself tearing apart his enemies, their screams a symphony of praise. He saw a river of blood in which he bathed, laughing, while the stars wept green fire. And then he saw himself, truly saw himself through the wyrdstone's gaze, a pitiful, rotting creature, meat wrapped around hatred and despair. An insect writhing in the gutter, oblivious to its insignificance. The visions ended as suddenly as they had begun. Regul collapsed to his knees, gasping and sobbing, blood streaming from his eye sockets, ears, and mouth. The wyrdstone pulsed again, and a hairline fracture split the largest crystal with a sharp crack like a gunshot. Something was coming. Something ancient and wrong. Regul crawled backward, heedless of the jagged rocks tearing into his palms and knees. He needed to get out. He needed to warn someone, or at least find someone to blame. The wyrdstone bloom shuddered once more, shedding a rain of fine green dust that hissed as it hit the ground. The cavern shook, loose stones raining down like the first drops of a storm. The walls groaned, the very earth seeming to protest the abomination festering within it. As Regul fled into the darkness, broken and bleeding, the bloom continued to grow. And far above, on the ruined streets of Mordheim, the first tremors of chaos stirred once more. Chapter 2. Whispering Shadows. The broken city of Mordheim was a corpse picked clean by crows, but even in death it bred new hungers. Whispers spread like contagion through the alleys and ruins, carried by rat-men, mad prophets, and black-toothed beggars. They spoke of a wyrdstone bloom in the depths, vast beyond reckoning, throbbing with a power that twisted reality itself. Some called it a blessing of the dark gods, others a curse that would gnaw at the very bones of the world. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: those who seized it could remake their fate, or drown in their own blood. The first to hear were the Crimson Fangs. They were a ragged band of cutthroats, outcasts and deserters, led by Varnock Redhand, a towering brute whose left arm ended in a gnarled claw of fused bone and iron. His face was a ruin of old scars, his remaining eye a molten ember in the gloom. The fangs had been scraping at the edge of Mordheim's carcass for too long, feeding off scraps. The wyrdstone bloom called to them, with promises too sweet to ignore. "We move at dusk," Varnock growled to his lieutenants, voice grinding like stones. "No quarter. No prisoners. The stone is ours." The Duskborn were next. A secretive cult that worshipped Morrslieb's green madness, they had long dwelt in the shadowed catacombs. Cloaked in ragged robes stitched with bone charms and flickering glyphs, they whispered to the spirits of the comet's dead. Their leader, Sister Valiska, spoke only in riddles, her eyes milk-white and unblinking. She sat in a circle of chanting acolytes, blood dripping from their tongues as they tore secrets from the dead wind. In the pale light of guttering candles, she shivered with ecstasy and proclaimed, "The dreaming stone awakens. Its song must be claimed before the waking world devours it." Their black procession slithered into the tunnels, trailing incense and madness. Last came the Grey Pikes. A mercenary band, grim and humorless, forged from the dregs of a dozen lost causes. They were men and women who had abandoned hope in exchange for steel and silver. Their captain, Hagen Krill, was a man carved from granite, his face a cold mask of iron discipline. The Pikes had no love for Wyrdstone or the superstitions of Mordheim. They sought only the fortune it promised. "We take it," Hagen said simply, "or we die trying." And so they marched. The Undercity was a labyrinth of broken dreams and festering nightmares. Every corridor was a wound, every echo a threat. The walls wept slime, and ancient graffiti glared down with hollow-eyed spite. Rats the size of terriers watched from the shadows, their red eyes gleaming with malevolence. The warbands moved like predators in a dying forest. The crimson fangs prowled through the southern sewers, their rusted blades catching the scant light in murderous flashes. Varnock led them personally, his claw flexing with anticipation. In the drowned vaults to the east, the Duskborn chanted in low, droning tones, their pale faces smudged with ash. Shadows clung unnaturally to their forms, making them seem more ghost than flesh. The Grey Pikes took the most direct route, straight through the ossuary district, where the dead outnumbered the living tenfold. They hacked their way through piles of bones and ancient coffins, each footstep kicking up clouds of choking dust. Violence erupted almost immediately. At the Convent of Broken Bells, a half-submerged ruin where rotted prayer flags fluttered like tattered wings, the Crimson Fangs encountered a scouting party of the Duskborn. The clash was sudden, brutal, and soaked in red. The Duskborn initiated the attack, hurling crude bone javelins and shrieking curses that thickened the air with delirium. Two Fangs dropped instantly, frothing at the mouth, clawing their own throats open with filthy nails. Varnock roared and charged, his iron claw cleaving a Duskborn priestess in half at the waist. Her entrails spilled in steaming ropes across the cracked tiles, the stink of bile and charred meat filling the corridor. Another Duskborn acolyte tried to flee, but Varnock's lieutenant fell upon him like jackals, knives flashing in a frenzy of wet, chopping sounds. The survivors scattered into the blackness, their songs of madness trailing behind them. Further west, the Grey Pikes encountered worse. The tunnels grew narrow and twisted, forcing them into a bottleneck where the very stones seemed to whisper and shift. Strange, malformed shadows flickered at the edges of their vision. Men muttered prayers, or wept openly, their nerves stretched taut as wire. Then came the attack, not from men, but from the rats. A tide of them, thousands strong, eyes alight with unnatural hunger, surged from the cracks and holes. They poured over the Pikes, biting, clawing, tearing. Screams filled the narrow tunnel as hardened mercenaries were dragged down and devoured alive, their armor useless against the writhing mass. Hagen Krill fought like a man possessed, his halberd scything through the swarm, each swing sending broken rat bodies spinning. His voice rang out over the chaos, a hammer blow of will. "Hold the line! Hold the line, damn you!" The Pikes rallied, forming a ragged shield wall, their boots slipping in gore. Slowly, inch by bloody inch, they fought their way free, leaving behind a corridor heaped with twitching corpses and rivers of red. By the time the three warbands staggered into the lower reaches of the Undercity, they were bloodied, battered, and burning with a single terrible purpose. The wyrdstone bloom waited, pulsing and whispering. People who had once been happy crawled into their minds, promising vengeance, power, absolution. Each warband thought themselves the master of their own fate. Each was wrong. The bloom was calling them not to victory, but to damnation. And deep below, unseen eyes opened in the dark. Chapter 3. An Uneasy Alliance. The Undercity groaned under the weight of ancient sins and new ambitions. Flickering torchlight danced across the broken walls, casting the faces of killers and zealots in a theater of flickering shadow. Blood smeared the flagstones, seeping into the marrow of Mordheim's shattered bones. Here, In the bleeding heart of the ruins, 3 warbands, sworn enemies by blood, creed, and coin, stood facing one another in a silence thicker than the grave air around them. Crimson Fangs. Duskborn. 3 pikes. Each group bristled, weapons loose in calloused hands, murder barely restrained. It would take a miracle, or a monster, to bind them together. The man who stepped forward was no miracle worker. He was the monster. Jerry Guar, captain of the Grey Pikes, once a knight of Reckland before disgrace and betrayal had cast him into Mordheim's maw. He wore no insignia now, only battered steel and a wolfish smile that did not touch his dead gray eyes. His face was a map of old wounds, a brutal scar carved down his jaw, another splitting his brow, his nose long since broken into a crooked ruin. He strode into the space between the warbands, boots crunching on fragments of bone and glass. "Enough," he growled, voice rough as gravel. "The bloom calls. We bleed each other now, and we'll never reach it." Behind him, his pikes locked shields with grim precision, a wall of iron and hatred. They were few but disciplined, veterans of countless slaughters. Their armor bore no sigils, only the scars of 100 desperate battles. Across from him, Varnock Redhand of the Crimson Fangs sneered. His claw twitched, hungry for blood. Flanking him were his killers, their weapons pitted and blackened with old gore. They shifted, growling low, their yellowed teeth flashing in the torchlight. Sister Valiska of the Duskborn stood to the side, swaying gently as if caught in an unseen tide. Her acolytes clustered close, muttering prayers in a dozen blasphemous tongues. Their eyes glimmered with feverish devotion, and their blades were already wet with offerings to gods too ancient and hungry to name. Jarek met Varnock's smoldering gaze first. "We fight now," he said. "We die in these tunnels. The bloom grows stronger by the hour. You can feel it, can't you?" The ground itself seemed to pulse in agreement, a faint tremor underfoot, like the heartbeat of some vast slumbering beast. Varnock's lip curled back in a snarl, but he stayed his claw. Jarek turned to Valiska next. "You seek the stone's blessing. We seek its riches. Different prayers, same path." Valiska tilted her head, her expression unreadable behind the cracked porcelain mask she wore. A string of crimson saliva dangled from her lips before she spoke. "The stone dreams of blood and unity," she intoned. "We shall dance its will for a time." Jarrett nodded, the ghost of a smirk tugging at the corner of his ruined mouth. "Then it's settled," he said. "Temporary alliance. No treachery until the bloom is in sight." He held out a gloved hand, fingers scarred and missing 2 nails. The gesture was absurd, an offer of trust in a city that had long since forgotten the word. Varnock stepped forward first. He spat into Jarek's palm, a thick goblet of bloody phlegm. Jarek smiled, sharp and humorless, and grasped Varnock's forearm in a warrior's grip. Sister Valiska approached last. She did not spit. Instead, she sliced a thin line across her palm with a jagged shard of glass and pressed it to Jarek's hand. Blood mingled, hissing faintly as it touched his skin, leaving a burning brand of agreement. The pact was forged. They moved as one now, though mistrust curdled the air between them like sour milk. Down into the deeper tunnels they descended, the passageways narrowing to choking claustrophobia. The architecture grew stranger, the stones fused and warped by wyrdstone energies. Columns twisted into grotesque mockeries of human forms. Floors heaved and buckled like frozen waves, making every step a battle for balance. From the gloom came the first test of their alliance. A shriek split the air, high, warbling, unnatural. From the broken arches ahead, a swarm of things poured forth. They were once human, perhaps, but the wyrdstone had undone them. Their flesh sagged and writhed like wet clay, limbs melting into each other in boneless masses. Some dragged themselves forward with splintered arms, others loped with grotesque, spider-like gaits, jaws gaping wide enough to split their heads in half. The first of the creatures hit the crimson fangs like a battering ram. The fang was ripped apart before he could scream. His innards spilled across the stones in steaming loops. His killer, no, his devourer, buried its face in his gut, feeding with slurping, greedy sounds. Varnock bellowed in fury, his claw lashing out. It caught a mutant mid-lunge, tearing its torso from its legs in a spray of black ichor. The two halves twitched independently for a few horrific seconds before going still. The Duskborn unleashed their own horrors. Valiska muttered a guttural incantation, and from the shadows came spectral things, wraith-like shapes of bone and smoke that tore through the mutants, unraveling them like rotten cloth. Jarek and the Grey Pike stood firm, shields locked, spears stabbing with cold, mechanical precision. Where the Fangs fought with berserk fury and the Duskborn with eldritch madness, the Pikes fought like a machine of war, grinding inexorably forward. The battle was a blur of blood and shrieks. Gore slicked the stones underfoot. Teeth clattered to the floor like hail. One Pike was dragged down, his throat torn open in a fountain of arterial spray, but his comrades did not flinch. They simply stepped over his thrashing body and kept advancing. Minutes or lifetimes later, silence fell. The floor was littered with twitching corpses, their flesh still bubbling and mutating even in death. Jarek surveyed the carnage, his face unreadable. "Get used to it," he muttered. "This is only the beginning." And in the distance, the wyrdstone bloom pulsed again, once, twice, like a beacon calling them deeper into damnation. Chapter 4. The First Mirage. The tunnels reeked of piss, mold, and death, and the deeper the Alliance trudged, the more the air itself seemed to shimmer with invisible currents. No words passed between them now. Every man, woman, and wretch carried violence tightly coiled within, as if the mere tension of silence could shatter it. It was during this grim march that the Skaven struck. The first warning was a wet, chittering screech from somewhere beyond the cracked stone archway ahead, followed by a flash of movement, too fast, too low to the ground. Then they poured forth from the shadows, a swarm of vermin twisted into humanoid mockeries, clad in rusted scraps of armor, their filthy weapons glinting under the flickering torchlight. Their eyes gleamed a feral red, and their rancid breath steamed in the chill air. The Crimson Fangs met the charge with howling fury. Varnock Redhand hurled himself into the thick of the rats, his iron claw hammering a Skaven into the wall so hard its spine snapped audibly. The Duskborn followed, their chants rising into a shrill cacophony, their rusted blades slicing through flesh and fur with wild abandon. The Grey Pikes fell into disciplined ranks, shields braced, spears punching out with ruthless precision. At first it seemed they had the upper hand. The Skaven were vicious but disorganized, snapping and slashing more from desperation than strategy. Then the air shifted. It started subtly, a shimmer at the edge of sight, a faint hum that wormed its way beneath the skin like 1,000 crawling insects. And then the mirage bloomed. Jarek Varn blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, but when he opened his eyes again, he did not see Skaven. He saw Crimson Fangs, their faces twisted into snarling masks of hatred, charging at him with weapons raised. Across the tunnel, Hagen Krill screamed a warning that died in his throat as one of the Duskborn lunged at him, face shifting between familiar and monstrous in the torchlight. Panic ignited, like oil on water. Varnock bellowed in rage as he saw Grey Pikes rushing toward him, spears lowered. In truth, they fought against the Skaven, but to Varnock's maddened eyes, they were traitors. The Uneasy Alliance shattered in an instant. Blades turned on supposed allies. A crimson fang drove his dagger into the throat of a gray pike, wrenching it free with a gout of arterial spray. The pike collapsed, clutching at the gaping wound, his lifeblood pattering the stones in hot rivulets. Jarek slashed his longsword across a duskborn acolyte's face, splitting it open from brow to jaw in a fountain of gore, the man's death scream gurgling as he collapsed. Only after the corpse hit the ground did Jarek recognize the acolyte's features. The man had fought beside him not minutes ago. Sister Veliska shrieked a curse, her blood-slicked fingers drawing grotesque symbols in the air, the glyphs twisted into existence, wrapping around the heads of her own cultists. Some shriveled where they stood, collapsing into twitching, shrieking husks. Among the chaos, the true Skaven struck like vipers. They danced between the battling humans, stabbing into kidneys, hamstrings, and armpits with wickedly curved blades. One pike screamed as a Skaven plunged a jagged dagger through his eye socket, twisting it until the sound of grating bone filled the tunnel. Another fang was dragged to the ground, squealing like a hog as a swarm of rats tore open his belly and rooted through his intestines. Jarek fought mechanically, every instinct honed from decades of battle screaming at him to survive. His sword cleaved through the air, severing heads and limbs, but it was like trying to cut through a living sea. Blood, bright red and filthy black, splashed across his face, stinging his eyes and mouth. In the heart of the melee, Varnock faced a hulking figure that wore the face of Jarek Varn, only it sneered with betrayal. With a roar, he hurled himself at the apparition, his claw raking across its chest, sending chunks of armor and flesh flying. The illusion gave a cry so human, so real, that it stayed Varnock's hand for a heartbeat. Long enough for the real enemy to strike. A Skaven assassin leapt from the shadows, its poison dagger plunging deep into Varnock's flank. The mutant bellowed in pain, backhanding the creature with enough force to smash its skull flat against the wall, but the damage was done. Blood poured from the wound, thick and dark, and Varnock staggered, clutching at his side. Amidst the madness, a horn blew, a deep, ragged note that echoed through the catacombs. It was Jarek's call to retreat. Few heard it. Fewer obeyed. Some fought to the death, lost in illusion and madness. Others, staggering and blood-soaked, fell back into the side tunnels, leaving a trail of blood and broken bodies behind them. Jarek was among the last to leave. He dragged a wounded pike, his name already forgotten, away from the carnage, the man moaning weakly with every step. He looked back once. The tunnel was a vision of hell, Skaven and men tearing at each other. Illusions twisting reality into a nightmare of shifting faces and endless slaughter. Torches guttered and fell, plunging whole sections into darkness broken only by the flash of blades and the pulsing, sickly glow of the wyrdstone deep below. The First Mirage had broken them. Trust, already stretched to the snapping point, had been gutted by treachery conjured from their own minds. Bloomed. And the wyrdstone bloom pulsed again, stronger, hungrier, feeding on every drop of spilled blood. Chapter 5. Splintering Trust. The survivors staggered through the broken corridors of Mordheim's undercity, a battered procession of blood, steel, and suspicion. What had once been a tenuous alliance now barely clung to the brittle shell of civility. Every glance was a knife. Every whispered word, a coiled serpent, ready to strike. Their torches sputtered weakly in the stale, damp air, casting trembling shadows that twitched and slithered along the cracked walls. The ground underfoot was slick with blood, mud, and the unidentifiable fluids of the mutated things they had left in their wake. The echoes of the Skaven ambush still hung in the tunnels like sour smoke, a memory that gnawed at every mind. Captain Jarek Varn led from the front, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep and the creeping itch of distrust. Blood matted his graying hair and soaked into the cracks of his battered armor. His sword, nicked and dulled from endless violence, rested heavily in his hand. He had trusted no one when this began. Now, even the thought of reliance felt like madness. Behind him limped the remnants of the gray pikes, little more than a dozen battered souls. Their shields were cracked, their armor gouged and pitted, their faces pale and hollow-eyed. Each man carried not just wounds of flesh, but deeper cuts, wounds to the spirit that no healing could mend. Varanok Red Hand, the brutish leader of the Crimson Fangs, stalked near the rear of the column, one arm wrapped tightly around his bleeding side where the Skaven's blade had found him. His clawed hand twitched with every heartbeat, as if itching to lash out. The few Fangs who still lived gathered close around him, muttering and glaring at the others with the feral wariness of cornered wolves. Sister Valiska moved almost imperceptibly along the walls, her bone-talismaned robes whispering against the stone. Her eyes, wide and fever-bright, never stopped moving. She clutched a heavy tome to her breast, her blood-stained fingers tracing symbols along its binding with mechanical devotion. Her followers, reduced to a scattered handful, kept their heads bowed, mumbling incoherent prayers. The silence between them stretched, brittle as glass. It was Mirek, one of the Crimson Fangs, who shattered it. "I saw them," he hissed, voice tight with fear and accusation. His finger jabbed toward the gray pikes. "During the fight, they turned on us. I saw it with my own eyes." A low growl rumbled from the ranks of the Fangs. Weapons shifted in clammy hands. "You soar lies," spat Hagen Krill, second in command to Jarek, stepping forward. Blood trickled from a split lip, but his voice was iron. "Illusions, magic. You're too stupid to tell friend from foe when rats piss in your eyes." "Enough," Jarek barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip crack. The company halted. In the weak circle of torchlight, the three leaders faced each other, the space between them heavy with menace. "You felt it too," Jarek said, his voice low but carrying. "The wyrdstone. It's infecting our minds, twisting what we see, making enemies where there are none." "Are you so sure?" Varnock sneered, blood flecking his cracked lips. His eye gleamed with a fevered light. "Or do you hide your treachery behind pretty words, mercenary?" Jarek stepped forward until they were nearly nose to nose. The smell of blood and rot from Varnock was almost overpowering. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't be breathing," Jarek said coldly. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Valiska's laughter floated through the tunnel, a sound brittle and wrong, like glass scraping against bone. "You squabble like children over a carcass," she crooned. "The stone stirs. It watches. It hungers. We are but puppets dancing on its strings." The others turned toward her warily. Valiska tilted her head, her pale tongue flicking across cracked lips. "The wyrdstone bloom does not promise unity," she whispered. "It feeds on our fear. It thrives on our betrayal. It will have its fill." Jarek felt it then, deep in his marrow, the truth of her words. Trust here was an illusion, a ghost as dangerous as any blade. "We stay together," he said, voice hoarse, "or we die apart." "No," rasped Varnock. "We stay together until you betray us. And when you do, I'll gut you first." With a snarl, he turned away, his followers close behind, leaving bloody footprints in the dust. Valiska's smile widened beneath her cracked mask. She said nothing more, only drifted into the gloom with her chanting disciples, their voices rising in a sickening harmony. Jarek remained a moment longer, alone in the center of the tunnel, feeling the wyrdstone's distant pulse crawling along his skin like a fever. He tightened his grip on his sword and moved on. The Alliance was already dead. Only the killing remained. Chapter 6. Dream-Eaters. The darkness beyond the guttering torches seemed thicker now, more intentional, as if the tunnels themselves sought to smother the flickering light. Every step forward dragged through a mire of tension, distrust curling like smoke through the warband's shattered ranks. It was here, in this heavy, stinking silence, that something new began to hunt them. It started as a vibration, a low, tremulous hum that thrummed through the soles of their boots, barely noticeable over the ragged breath and dragging steps of the survivors. Then, the air grew colder, the damp chill clinging to flesh like clammy hands. Even the rats, those eternal scavengers, had fled, their absence a silent scream in the empty corridors. Varnick Redhand was the first to notice. He halted abruptly, his clawed hand twitching, his single good eye narrowing into the blackness ahead. His men muttered uneasily behind him, their blades whispering from their sheaths as they drew steel. "What is it?" spat Jarek, his sword already in hand. Varnick said nothing. He simply pointed. There, ahead of them in the tunnel, something moved. It shambled from the gloom on stilt-like legs of exposed sinew and warped bone, its body little more than a sagging sack of pale, translucent flesh. Beneath its slick skin, organs throbbed and shifted, grotesquely visible like things trapped in amber. Its head, or what passed for one, was a smooth, featureless bulb, save for a single gaping maw that gnashed in silent hunger. It exuded a choking stench, a blend of rotted meat, sulfur, and cold iron. The Dream-Eater. As it approached, the wyrdstone embedded in the walls began to pulse in rhythm with its shambling steps, the green light throbbing brighter, faster. Jarek's head snapped back, a sudden wave of vertigo crashing over him. Around him the others staggered, some crying out, some dropping their weapons with clattering echoes. Then the hallucinations began. One of the Grey Pikes, a grizzled veteran named Luthar, shrieked and fell to his knees, clawing at his own face. "They're inside!" he screamed, fingers raking bloody furrows down his cheeks. "Inside my skull!" The dusk-born acolyte turned on his fellows, his blade flashing through the air in wild, desperate arcs. His first strike opened a deep gash across another cultist's face, splitting nose and lips into a gory ruin. The wounded man staggered back, choking on his own blood, before collapsing into spasms. Veliska herself stumbled, her pupils swallowing the whites of her eyes as she gibbered nonsense prayers to dead gods. Jarek felt it too. Images swarmed his mind, visions of betrayal, of his men turning on him, of Varnock driving his claw through his gut, of Sister Valiska whispering poison into the ears of his closest comrades. The illusions were perfect, seamless, every detail sharpened to unbearable clarity. He bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste blood, grounding himself in the pain. "Form up!" he bellowed, voice ragged but commanding. "Form up, damn you!" Few responded. The Dream-Eater slithered closer, impossibly fast now, its legs extending, joints bending backward in unnatural contortions. The maw opened wider, revealing rows of glistening needle-sharp teeth. It did not strike with claws or blades. It struck with terror. Luthar, still clawing at himself, gave a final, pitiful wail before his body convulsed violently. His chest heaved once, twice, and then exploded outward in a shower of blood and viscera. From the ragged cavity, a twisted mockery of his own face emerged, its flesh unfinished, teeth gnashing mindlessly. It was as if the Dream-Eater had birthed a nightmare from within him. The Grey Pikes recoiled in horror, several turning to flee. The Dream-Eater lunged. It impaled one fleeing pike on a crooked limb, the jagged bone punching through armor and ribcage with obscene ease. The man was lifted into the air, his legs kicking spasmodically, before the creature bit down, severing him at the waist with a wet crunch. Gouts of blood sprayed across the tunnel walls in wide, steaming arcs. Varnock, roaring a wordless battle cry, charged the creature, his iron claw swinging low. He struck its leg, slicing through tendons and bone, but the Dream-Eater only staggered momentarily. It pivoted unnaturally, whipping another limb around and catching Varnock across the ribs. The mutant leader was hurled bodily into the wall, bricks shattering under the impact. He slumped, dazed and bleeding heavily. "Fall back," Jarek screamed, grabbing Hagen by the shoulder and hauling him toward a side passage. "Regroup." Valeska stumbled after them, dragging two of her remaining cultists, her bloodless lips moving in frantic, whispered invocations. The survivors fled into the side tunnels, the Dream-Eater shrieking after them, the sound a keening wail that flayed the mind like a razor across the soul. They ran blind through the blackness, deeper into the labyrinthine ruin, until at last they collapsed against the walls, panting and bloodied. For a long time no one spoke. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic pulse of the wyrdstone, and the echo of the Dream-Eater's shriek still reverberating through the dying veins of Mordheim. It was not hunting them for food. It was hunting them for their dreams, their fears, their hopes, their sanity. And it would not stop until they were hollowed out, nothing more than meat shells stuffed with nightmares. Chapter 7. A Pact Broken. The survivors huddled in the ruins of what had once been a chapel, now nothing more than a collapsed cavern, swallowed by the Undercity's decay. Crumbled altars lay like toppled giants, and the faded murals of forgotten saints wept streaks of green mold. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood and the cloying sweetness of rot. Torches burned low, their meager flames casting sickly shadows across the battered faces of those still breathing. Jarek Varn sat apart from the others, his sword resting across his knees, every muscle in his body coiled tight with exhaustion and suspicion. Hagen tended to the wounded, his hands mechanical, detached. Sister Valeska whispered over her dead, her bony fingers tracing obscene symbols in the blood-slicked dust. Varnock Redhand and his crimson fangs crouched together near a broken archway, murmuring amongst themselves. Their leader's hulking form was half hidden in the gloom, his iron claw flexing idly, tapping out a slow, arrhythmic beat against the stones. His wound, though hastily wrapped, oozed black blood with every twitch. Something was wrong. Jarek could feel it vibrating in the marrow of his bones. He watched as one of Varnock's lieutenants, Marek, a thin, rat-eyed man with a perpetual sneer, shifted away from the group, casting furtive glances at the gray pikes. His hand never strayed far from the hilt of his curved dagger. Jarek tightened his grip on his sword. If they make a move, it happened faster than a heartbeat. With a sudden bellow, Varnock surged to his feet, his good hand pointing directly at Jarek. "The wyrdstone is ours," he roared, voice thick with madness. "You mean to steal it? I see it! I see it!" Before Jarek could rise, the crimson fangs leapt into motion. Mirek lunged at a pike tending a wounded comrade, his dagger plunging deep into the man's throat. The pike convulsed, hands clawing feebly at the slick steel buried in him before crumpling into the dirt, a river of crimson pumping from the gash. Chaos erupted. The crimson fangs fell upon the gray pikes and duskborn alike, weapons flashing in the sick light. Screams tore the air apart. The fragile alliance, already frayed to threads, shattered in a geyser of violence. Jarek parried a wild slash from a fang, driving his blade through the attacker's gut with a wet, meaty crunch. The man's face twisted in shock, blood bubbling from his lips as he slid off the blade and collapsed. "Fall back!" Jarek roared, but the words were drowned in the tide of bloodshed. Valeska screeched like a wounded hawk, raising a bone-handled dagger and carving symbols into the air. Ghostly tendrils of smoke erupted from the ground, wrapping around a group of fangs and dragging them screaming into the earth. Their shrieks echoed, rising to a fever pitch before cutting off in abrupt, grisly silence. But it wasn't enough. The crimson fangs fought like men possessed, eyes glassy with unnatural light, faces twisted into rictus grins. They fought not for survival, but for the false visions the Wyrdstone had planted in their minds, visions of endless treasure, of thrones built from the bones of their enemies, of godhood. Varnock was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of brute force and savagery. His claws sheared through a pike's shield like parchment, the metal shrieking as it split. The soldier barely had time to scream before Varnock crushed his rib cage into a mangled ruin, flesh and bones spraying in a wide arc. Jarek fought his way toward the center of the melee, cutting down two fangs who barred his path. His arms burned with effort, and every wound wept fresh pain, but he pushed forward, teeth bared in a snarl. He found Varnock at the shattered altar, looming over a fallen pike. Their eyes met across the corpse-littered floor. Varnock's face was a grotesque mask of triumph and insanity. His voice gurgled out between blood-flecked teeth. "I saw it. The stone it showed me. You would have stolen it." Jarek said nothing. Words were dust here. With a roar, Varnock charged. The two collided with the force of a collapsing building. Jarek twisted aside, narrowly avoiding a killing swipe from the iron claw. He drove his sword into Varnock's side, feeling it bite deep into corrupted flesh, but the mutant only laughed, grabbing the blade with his bare hand and yanking it free, blood pouring from his palm in black, viscous streams. Varnock swung his claw, catching Jarek across the chest. The impact hurled Jarek backward, slamming him into the shattered remains of the altar. Stone bit into his back. His breath left him in a harsh wheeze. Varnock stalked forward, each step a thunderclap in Jarek's ears. But the Wyrdstone's influence had overreached. As Varnock raised his claw for the killing blow, his vision swam. For a moment he saw Jarek not as an enemy, but as a bloodied mirror image of himself, claw and all, grinning with betrayal. Varnock hesitated. It was all the opening Jarek needed. With a bellow, Jarek drove a broken shard of altar stone into Varnock's gut. The makeshift blade punched through rotted armor, crunching into bone with a hideous sound. Varnock's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. He staggered back, staring down at the stone jutting from his belly, disbelief painted across his ruined features. Then he collapsed like a felled tree, blood pooling beneath him in a thick, steaming tide. The crimson fangs, seeing their leader fall, faltered. The gray pikes and the few remaining duskborn struck with savage precision, cutting them down or driving them screaming into the dark. And then, just like that, the battle was over. The ruined chapel was a charnel house, the stones slick with gore, the air heavy with death. Bodies lay piled in heaps, twitching, moaning, dying. Jarek pulled himself upright, blood oozing from the torn rents in his armor. The crimson fangs were broken. The pact was broken. And somewhere, far below, the wyrdstone bloom pulsed in the darkness, feeding hungrily on the betrayal and blood it had sown. Chapter 8. Labyrinth of Echoes. The blood had barely dried on the shattered stones when the survivors pressed on, driven by a grim inertia that neither reason nor sanity could check. The ruined chapel was a tomb behind them now, and ahead stretched the labyrinth. An endless maze of forgotten tunnels, sunken crypts, and collapsed corridors that twisted like a serpent's guts beneath Mordheim's shattered bones. They were fewer now. Jarek Varn leading the broken remnants of the Grey Pikes, Sister Valiska with her dwindling cult of whispering madmen. Their armor hung heavy with congealed blood. Their eyes were glassy, hollowed by exhaustion, fear, and the lingering touch of the Wyrdstone's curse. The deeper they plunged, the more the architecture itself seemed to lose cohesion. Walls buckled and curved without logic. Corridors doubled back on themselves like the folds of a lunatic's brain. Faded frescoes bled across ceilings and floors, colors running like fresh wounds, forming grotesque parodies of saints and martyrs. But it was the sounds that truly broke them. It began with a low hum, felt more in the bones than heard with the ears, a subsonic vibration that throbbed in time with the pulsing wyrdstone buried deep below. Then came the whispers, slithering at the edge of hearing, voices known and loved, calling out from the blackness. Jarek froze mid-step as he heard it, a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years, one that should have rotted away in a grave outside Altdorf. "Brother, help me." He spun, sword flashing up defensively, but saw only darkness yawning behind him. Hagen grunted, clutching his head. Blood trickled from his nose. They're in our heads, Captain," he rasped. "This place, it remembers us." Ahead, one of the gray pikes broke formation with a sob. He staggered down a side corridor, calling a name with desperate, broken hope. Jarek recognized it, a dead wife, long gone. "Stay together," Jarek barked, but it was too late. The pike's scream rang out moments later, sharp and wet. When they found him, his body was pinned to the wall, mouth stretched into a rictus grin, hands nailed to the stone with shards of wyrdstone. His eyes stared glassily at nothing, and where his heart should have been, there was only a seething mass of black mold. They moved faster after that, but the labyrinth fought them at every step. The walls moaned and shifted. New corridors yawned open like starving mouths. Doors appeared where none had been, leading into rooms filled with rotting banquets, twisted orgies of long-dead nobles feasting eternally on their own decay. Sister Valiska swayed as she walked, her bare feet bleeding from unseen cuts. Her cultists fared worse. One clutched at invisible chains around his neck, gasping for air until his throat collapsed into a pulpy mass. Another tore his own eyes out, screeching that they were filled with spiders spun from the light of Morrslieb. They passed through a grand hall, its vaulted ceiling lost in blackness. Along the cracked marble floor lay rows of statues, too lifelike, too detailed. As they moved between them, Jarek realized with a sick lurch that these were no statues. They were corpses, preserved perfectly in moments of terror, their mouths open in silent screams, their limbs frozen mid-fleet. The labyrinth was not empty. It was watching. At every turn, more echoes baited them. The great pike, named Torin, dropped his shield and wept openly when he heard the voice of his daughter, a daughter who had died choking on pox-riddled blood a decade before. He rushed toward the sound, deeper into a narrowing corridor lined with broken pews and collapsed arches. Jarek gave chase but found only the aftermath, the crushed remnants of Torin's body, flattened and twisted, as if by the careless footfall of some titanic beast. The bones jutted through the flesh like the splintered timbers of a shipwreck. The survivors drew closer together, their weapons no longer held against the shadows, but against each other. Every glance was a judgment, every step a gamble against madness. The labyrinth led them into a domed chamber, where the walls pulsed and breathed, the very stones slick with a sheen of sweat. A cracked dais rose at the center, and atop it, an altar fashioned from broken wyrdstone shards jutted like a rotted crown. Upon the altar knelt a figure, back turned, weeping softly. Never mind. Jarek's breath caught. He knew that voice. His mother, lost to plague when he was just a boy. He had buried her with his own shaking hands. "Jarek, my sweet boy, please." He took a step forward, sword lowering against his will. A hand gripped his arm, Hagen, his face a twisted snarl of defiance and terror. "Don't," Hagen hissed through gritted teeth. "It's not real." Jarek wrenched his gaze away, the spell broken, but others were not so lucky. 2 duskborn acolytes rushed the altar, their hands outstretched in supplication. The weeping figure turned, revealing a mouth that split from ear to ear, lined with writhing tendrils. It leapt with impossible speed, latching onto the nearest cultist and dragging him screaming into its body. The second tried to flee, but was seized by a lash of wyrdstone energy that flayed the flesh from his bones in a heartbeat, leaving a steaming, twitching skeleton to crumple into the dust. The survivors fled the chamber, hearts hammering, the echoes of their lost loved ones chasing them through the corridors, mocking them, beckoning them. Every step deeper into the labyrinth was a step away from reason, from memory, from the self. And still, through it all, the wyrdstone bloom pulsed, slow and patient, waiting at the center of the madness it had birthed, hungering for the final pieces to fall apart. Chapter 9. The False Queen. They stumbled into a vast cavern, an underground cathedral whose blackened pillars clawed upward toward a ceiling lost in a smog of wyrdstone vapors. The floor was a sprawling mosaic, cracked and half-buried beneath the grime of centuries, but its shape was unmistakable, a great leering skull swallowing a sun swallowed in green flames. At the far end of the hall, atop a throne wrought from fused bone and shattered crystal, she waited. The False Queen. She rose from the mist as if birthed from the wyrdstone itself, a towering vision of impossible beauty and horror. Her skin shimmered with an iridescent glow, constantly shifting from flawless alabaster to cracked marble. Her robes were spun from the smoke of burning cities, her hair a living river of serpents and dying stars. Her eyes, gaping voids rimmed with bleeding gold, settled on them with the gravity of a collapsing sun. The survivors froze, every muscle locked by an unseen hand. Her voice poured into the cavern, sweet as poisoned honey, slipping past armor and bone, straight into the heart. Children of ruin, sons and daughters of ash, kneel. Some fell immediately, their weapons clattering forgotten to the stone. Jarek ground his teeth, his vision swimming. His mind, already battered by fear and hallucination, reeled under the onslaught. A vision slammed into him, himself crowned astride the corpse of Mordheim, its broken spires stitched into a throne of endless power. At his feet, the living and dead alike bowed, their faces blind and adoring. "Kneel, and I will grant you dominion over the hallowed city," the False Queen crooned. "Kneel, and you shall be gods among the ruins." To his left, Hagen swayed, his knuckles white around the haft of his halberd. Sweat poured down his brow. He took one step forward, then another. "No," Jarek snarled, slamming the pommel of his sword into Hagen's ribs. The man stumbled, the spell broken, blinking tears from his eyes. Around them, others were not so strong. 3 gray pikes fell to their knees, their faces slack, their mouths moving in wordless praise. One of the remaining duskborn, her mind shattered beyond mending, threw herself forward, crawling on all fours, leaving bloody smears where her knees scraped the shattered floor. Sister Veliska tilted her head, the corners of her cracked lips twisting into a smile, both adoring and calculating. She murmured to her remaining cultists in a sibilant tongue, and they followed her gaze with slavish devotion. The False Queen descended from her throne, gliding rather than walking. With every step the floor beneath her blackened and splintered, dead things stirring and writhing from the cracks. She extended a hand towards the kneeling. "My champions," she whispered, "swear yourselves to me, and all that you desire shall be made manifest." The first to offer blood was a pike named Kale. His hand trembled as he drew a knife across his palm, holding it aloft. His voice shook with reverence. "Yours, my queen." He never saw the dagger. Jarek moved with brutal economy. His blade punched through Kale's throat, severing spine and artery in one thrust. Blood geysered into the smoky air, painting the mosaic in fresh red. Ko fell, twitching, his last breath rattling wetly from the ragged hole in his neck. A silence followed, thick and poisonous. The false queen's face did not change, but the cavern seemed to darken, the air growing heavier, colder. "You would deny my gift," she purred, voice curdling into something hungry, predatory. Jarek stood firm, sword held low, ready to strike again. His body screamed for rest, but there would be no surrender. "We take nothing from lying ghosts," he spat. "Your dominion is dust, your throne rot." Around him the survivors stirred, torn between the hypnotic pull of the queen's promise and the grim anchor of Jarek's defiance. Davaliska's cultists chose their side first. Sister Valiska raised her arms, shrieking praises to the false queen. Her followers lunged at the gray pikes with wild abandon, their rusted knives flashing. The cavern exploded into violence. Jarek parried a wild slash, riposting with a brutal downward stroke that split a cultist's skull to the teeth. Hagen drove his halberd into another's guts, wrenching it free in a welter of intestines and shrieks. The loyal pikes fought like cornered beasts, cutting down the cultists who moments ago had been their tenuous allies. Through it all, the false queen watched impassively, her lips mouthing soundless commands that twisted the cultists' bodies even as they died, puppet limbs reaching out in final spasms to claw at their killers. Valiska herself hurled curses, black fire erupting from her hands, catching 2 pikes in a storm of burning, shrieking agony. Their armor twisted and fused to their flesh, their eyes boiling in their sockets before they crumpled into smoking heaps. Jarek met her eyes across the chaos. "Your queen lies," he roared, voice raw with hate. Valiska laughed, a high, broken sound, and charged. The clash was savage and immediate. She lashed out with a knife fashioned from human bone, but Jarek batted it aside, driving his fist into her jaw with a crack of snapping bone. She reeled but did not fall, her hand slashing across his chest, carving a shallow gouge through his armor. Jarek caught her wrist, twisted. With a brutal wrench, he snapped it, the bone breaking like dry wood. Valiska screamed, but Jarek did not relent. He shoved her to the floor, drove his sword down, pinning her through the gut. Blood welled thick and dark around the blade, soaking her ragged robes. Valiska's lips moved in a final, broken prayer to the false queen as the life ebbed from her body. The fight ended in choking gasps and the wet slap of dying bodies hitting stone. Only a handful remained. Jarek, Hagen, and 3 others stood amid a sea of corpses, their weapons dripping gore, their armor rent and battered. The false queen smiled, stepping back into the mist. "You will return to me," she whispered, "when hope dies and hunger remains." She faded into the vapor, her throne crumbling to ash. The survivors stood in the ruins of a dream that had almost devoured them, blood soaking their boots, breath ragged in the cold, heavy air. And still, the wyrdstone pulsed below, patient, waiting, drawing them ever deeper. Chapter 10. Blood on Broken Stone. The survivors trudged onward, the loss of the false queen still heavy on their minds. The caverns around them grew narrower, more claustrophobic, the walls pressing inward like a noose slowly tightening around a condemned man's throat. The stench of old death and wyrdstone corruption was unbearable now, a constant burning in the back of the throat. Their numbers were pitiful, only a few gray pikes still breathing, and fewer dusk-born acolytes, the latter hollow-eyed and twitching, their faith in their dead gods cracked beyond repair. The survivors were splintered into 2 distrustful knots, moving in awkward tandem, glancing sidelong at one another with suspicions sharp as razors. Tension coiled thickly in the air. Every whispered word, every sideways glance was a spark waiting for a powder keg. It took almost nothing to light the fuse. As they passed through a broken antechamber, a hall of shattered pillars and scattered bones, a gray pike named Breck stumbled, his boot catching on a hidden crack. He crashed into a duskborn named Mordheim, sending the smaller man sprawling into the dust. Mordheim, his nerves strung so taut they might have snapped from a breath, shrieked in rage and fear, scrambling upright with a dagger flashing in his fist. "You meant to kill me," he spat, eyes rolling wild in his skull. Breck barely had time to raise his hands in protest before Mordheim drove the dagger up into his gut. There was a sickening crack as it slid between the plates of armor and buried deep. Breck staggered back, blood gushing over his hands, pooling rapidly at his feet. A heartbeat of stunned silence. Then madness. The gray pikes roared, weapons leaping to hand, fury burning away what little reason remained. Hagen led the charge, his halberd cleaving Mordheim's head nearly in two, the split skull hanging by a ragged flap of sinew as the body toppled. The Duskborn screamed in defiance, their broken faith igniting into a suicidal frenzy. One hurled a glass vial that shattered against a pike's shield, splashing a burning alchemical substance that ate through steel and flesh alike. The pike howled as his arm disintegrated before he hit the floor, thrashing in agony. Jarek fought to regain order, but it was like shouting into a hurricane. He slammed his sword through a Duskborn who charged him, feeling ribs crack and organs split around the blade. He ripped it free with a grunt, turning just in time to parry a crude hatchet swung at his head. His life. The room became a slaughterhouse. Blood sprayed across the broken stones, painting them in slick crimson. Limbs flew. Screams rebounded off the jagged walls in a deafening cacophony. Eyes rolled in terror. Mouths gaped, trying to scream, trying to beg, only to be silenced by blades, by cudgels, by the merciless crush of boots and stone. Ogon grappled with a Duskborn twice his size, knives flashing between them. Hagen finally drove his thumbs into the man's eyes, pressing until something popped wetly. The cultist shrieked and clawed at his ruined face until Hagen brought his halberd down, splitting his skull cleanly in two with a wet, explosive sound. A pike named Yorick was pulled down by 3 Duskborn, their knives rising and falling in a brutal rhythm. When they finally staggered away, panting and blood-smeared, all that remained of Yorick was a twitching, red ruin barely recognizable as human. Jarek found himself back-to-back with Hagen, both of them hacking and parrying desperately, surrounded by dying, shrieking men. The floor became a river of blood, slick and treacherous. They slipped and stumbled through the viscera, struggling to stay up. At last silence fell. It was the silence of exhaustion, of death. Jarek wiped gore from his eyes with the back of his hand, breathing ragged and shallow. Around him lay the broken bodies of friend and foe alike, their blood mingling and running in sluggish rivulets across the shattered floor. Few had survived. Fewer still could claim to be unscarred. Of the Duskborn, none remained standing. The gray pikes fared little better. Only Hagen, Jarek, and 2 others remained, and even they bore wounds that would have downed lesser men. Jarek looked at the faces around him, drawn, pale, haunted, and saw no trust there. Only the raw, jagged edge of survival. No oaths would be sworn here. No alliances reforged. The Wyrdstone's corruption had done its work well. It had seeded madness and betrayal into their bones, and now only blood remained to water the cursed stone. They stood among the carnage, isolated by their own fear, by their own guilt, as the labyrinth whispered around them, calling them deeper, calling them home. Chapter 11. The Shard of Wyrd. The Undercity had descended into pure madness by now. the very air thick with unseen voices, the floor seeming to breathe beneath booted feet. Every shadow twitched, every whisper crawled under the skin like a parasite seeking to nest in the mind. It was here, far from the slaughter of the others, that Morella Shade emerged from the dust. She had always known how to survive. While the Crimson Fangs tore each other to pieces under Varnok's bloody dream, Morella had slipped away, silent, unseen, a wraith in human skin. Her fingers, deft and cunning, had picked the pockets of the dead and dying, and her narrow green eyes had scouted a path not toward confrontation, but toward opportunity. Now she led a splinter faction, 5 survivors, as desperate and mean as rats trapped in a burning granary. Thieves, deserters, and killers, all that remained of the warbands too broken to hold their banners aloft. Morella moved at the front, her dark hair clinging in sweaty tendrils to her sharp cheeks. Her battered leather armor hugged her slim frame, scratched and torn from 100 narrow escapes. A long dagger, stolen from a noble's corpse months ago, gleamed wickedly at her side. They crept through a passage narrower than a coffin, the air reeking of mildew and something fouler, something that oozed from the wyrdstone itself. Ahead, a faint glow pulsed. Not the furious, sickly green that had haunted their steps for days, but something subtler. Morella signaled a halt. Her hand shot up, 2 fingers rigid, and her followers froze as if their lives depended on it, which they did. She drew her dagger and inched forward, hugging the wall like a lizard clinging to stone. The corridor opened into a low chamber, its ceiling crumbling into jagged teeth. At the center, half buried in the collapsed floor, lay the shard. It pulsed gently, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The shard was no larger than a man's skull, a jagged splinter of wyrdstone with veins of silver and black twisting through the green. Around it, the very stones of Mordheim bent in strange ways, warping and twisting. But the air here, the air was clean, clear. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Morella's head wasn't filled with whispering ghosts. Her heart hammered in her ribs, not with fear, but with hope. She knelt by the shard, staring at her own reflection, distorted in its gleaming surface. Her face looked alien, gaunt, hollow-eyed, stained with the blood of friend and foe alike. Yet there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of the cunning, the hunger that had carried her through every betrayal and every bloodbath Mordheim had thrown at her. She reached out, hesitated, at the sound. One of her companions, Rolf, a wiry man with a mouthful of broken teeth, had edged too close. His greed outweighed his caution. Mova sighed. He growled, shoving Morella. The moment his foot crossed the invisible boundary near the shard, the air around him shattered. 1,000 howling faces erupted from the walls, dead lovers, betrayed brothers, devoured friends. They swarmed him, spectral hands tearing and raking. He shrieked, dropping his sword, falling to his knees as they clawed into his flesh. Morella watched coldly. Rolf clawed at the illusions, his nails tearing strips of his own skin from his arms, from his face. Blood splattered the stones, his eyes burst in their sockets, 2 red gushes spraying down his cheeks as he gurgled and toppled, still twitching, into the dirt. Silence fell. The shard pulsed once, as if in satisfaction. Morella rose, stepping carefully over the whitening pool of blood. The others, hard men who had seen death too many times to flinch, fell back, unwilling to challenge her now, not after witnessing what the shard demanded. With slow, reverent hands she wrapped her cloak around the shard and lifted it free. A shock rippled through her, cold and pure, washing away the grime clinging to her soul. For one dizzying moment she saw clearly the labyrinth, the bloom at its heart, the Dream-Eater lurking in the bones of the city, feeding, growing fat on the nightmares sown among the living. and she saw Jarek Varn, still alive, still stumbling through the ruins with the tattered remnants of his grey pikes. A smile curled her cracked lips. This shard was a weapon against the illusions, against the wyrdstone, against everything that had broken Mordheim's heart. But weapons demanded blood. She turned to her followers, eyes gleaming with the shard's cold reflection. "We find the others," she said softly, voice cutting through the stale air like a knife. "We burn the bloom from this pit, or we drown them in their own screams." The men nodded, cowed and eager for purpose. Mirella cradled the shard close to her chest as they slipped back into the tunnels, the faint pulse of it steady against her ribs. Behind them, the corpse of Rolf twitched one last time, the shadows crowding around his body, feeding on the last scraps of madness he had torn from himself. Ahead, Mordheim's undercity shifted and groaned, sensing the shard's awakening. And it honkered. Chapter 12. Reflections of Madness. The tunnels narrowed into a jagged throat of crumbling stone, the ceiling pressing low enough that Jarek and his men were forced to stoop, their armor scraping against the walls in a grating, metallic dirge. The air was thick, stinking of mildew, blood, and something fouler still, the sweet, cloying rot of wyrdstone corruption. Their torches sputtered and hissed in the dampness, throwing wild, frantic shadows that clawed at the walls. Every step felt heavier now, as if the ground itself resisted their passage, as if Mordheim's very bones sought to drag them down and swallow them whole. Jarek Varn led the way, grim-faced and silent, his sword hanging heavy at his side. Behind him shuffled Hagen and the last of the grey pikes, reduced now to a pathetic handful of bleeding, exhausted men. Their eyes were hollow, their movements mechanical, driven only by the stubborn will to survive another hour. The passage ended abruptly, opening into a vast circular chamber lined with cracked mirrors. Hundreds of them. Some stood in tarnished frames, others were shattered, their jagged edges jutting like broken teeth. Yet each reflected something, twisted, corrupted versions of those who entered, ghosts of what they were, what they feared they had become. The torches dimmed as they stepped inside. Jarek saw himself reflected 1,000 times, wounded, scarred, blood-soaked. In some mirrors he was younger, bright-eyed, full of foolish hopes. In others he was old and broken, a king of ashes seated on a throne of corpses. He forced his gaze forward, refusing to engage with the illusions. "It's a trick," he muttered under his breath, clenching his fists until his knuckles cracked. "Just another trick." Then he saw him. Standing across the chamber, untouched by the filth and the madness, was his brother, Alexon, dead 20 years, killed in the wars of Reikland, buried under a cairn of stones in a forgotten field far from Mordheim's cursed walls. Yet here he stood, hale and whole, clad in gleaming mail, a sword sheathed at his side, a crooked smile playing at his lips. The same smile that had gotten Jarek into countless brawls and scrapes in their youth. "Jarek," Alaric said, his voice clear and strong. "You found me." Jarek staggered back a step, bile rising in his throat. The sword slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the broken stone with a sound that echoed through the chamber like a death knell. "No," he rasped, shaking his head. "You're dead." Alaric stepped closer, boots silent on the cracked floor. His smile twisted, sadness bleeding into it. "I waited for you," he said, "all these years. You promised you'd come back for me." Behind Jarek, Hagen shouted something, but the words were distant, muffled, like sound through thick water. Alaric's eyes, those familiar, beloved eyes, filled with tears. "You left me, Jarek. You let me die." Jarek fell to his knees, hands digging into the filthy stone, his vision blurred. His mind buckled under the weight of guilt, of grief. he had long buried under layers of rage and blood and duty. "You're not real," he whispered, voice cracking. Alaric knelt before him, placing a hand, warm, solid, on his shoulder. "Come with me, brother," he said gently. "Leave this place. We can be together again." For a moment, just a moment, Jarek believed it. He reached out, fingers trembling. The mirrors flared, blinding white light bursting from their shattered faces. And in that light, Jarek saw the truth. He saw Alaric's death, not the noble end he had always imagined, but a grotesque slaughter. He saw his brother's body torn apart by plague-mutated beasts, his screams echoing across the wasteland. He saw himself, hundreds of versions of himself walking away from Alaric's grave without a backward glance, without a tear. The false Alaric's face twisted into a sneer, the hand on Jarek's shoulder tightening into a claw. "You left me to rot," it hissed, voice distorting, deepening into a guttural snarl. "Now rot with me." Jarek roared, in fury and despair, grabbing the dagger at his belt and driving it upward into the illusion's throat. The blade slid home with a wet, meaty sound. The thing posing as Alaric shrieked, face melting into a mass of writhing tendrils and blistered flesh. It staggered back, black ichor pouring from the gaping wound, before collapsing into a puddle of twitching, steaming gore. The mirrors around the chamber shattered all at once, a deafening chorus of glass exploding outward. Shards rained down, slicing into flesh. Jarek felt the sharp bite of a dozen shallow cuts but barely registered them. He knelt in the wreckage, chest heaving, blood dripping from his hands. Hagen rushed to his side, grabbing his shoulder. "Captain," he barked, shaking him, "get up, it's not done yet." Slowly, Jarek rose, his face a mask of blood and ash, his eyes hollow but burning with a grim, unbreakable fire. The chamber was a ruin, the mirrors destroyed, the false ghosts banished. But the madness remained, curling and gnawing at the edges of thought. And, deeper still, below the endless tunnels, the wyrdstone bloom pulsed hungrily, sensing the cracked spider-webbing through what little remained of Jarek Varn's soul. Chapter 13. Wyrdstone Puppets. The surviving gray pikes moved like shades through the undercity, their bodies battered, their souls fraying at the seams. Every step was an agony of blistered feet and trembling limbs. Around them, the tunnels breathed and shifted, the walls flexing like muscle, as if the city itself had been twisted into something alive and malignant. The wyrdstone pulse had grown stronger, its rhythm vibrating through the bones of the earth, through the marrow of every living thing. It gnawed at their sanity, whispering promises too sweet to ignore, threats too vivid to resist. And then came the sound, a low, wet, dragging noise, accompanied by the clatter of something heavy and broken scraping against stone. It echoed in the darkness, alien and unnatural, setting teeth on edge and hearts pounding. Jarek raised a hand, halting what remained of his men. They stood in a crooked passage, the floor littered with shattered masonry, and the half-devoured corpses of those who had come before. The stench of rot was a choking, living thing. From the shadows ahead they emerged. Puppets. At first glance, they were men, or what had once been men, but their flesh was wrong, their movements impossibly jerky and disjointed, as if unseen strings yanked them through the motions of life. Jagged shards of wyrdstone jutted from their bodies like parasitic growths, bursting through armor, bone, and sinew with grotesque abandon. Faces, some horribly familiar, twitched and spasmed. Mouths gaped in silent screams, eyes bulged, weeping trails of green ichor down cheeks half sloughed from the skull. One wore the remnants of a grey pike surcoat, the sigil now obscured by pulsing cysts of green crystal. Another had once been a dusk-born cultist, His skin blackened and split open like rotting fruit, exposing veins of wyrdstone threading through his muscle. The puppets moved with staggering insect-like awkwardness, their broken limbs bending at impossible angles, and behind them, pulling the invisible strings, loomed the Dream-Eater. It was worse than any nightmare. The creature had swollen since their last glimpse, fed fat on fear, on madness, on death. It slithered along the ceiling, a massive bulk of translucent, quivering flesh crisscrossed with throbbing black veins. Its eyeless head split into a vertical maw lined with rings of serrated teeth, and from its bloated underbelly dangled clusters of glistening, twitching tendrils. The tendrils burrowed into the puppets, rooted deep into the wyrdstone shards embedded in their flesh, guiding them, animating them, puppeteering their desecrated bodies. A sound issued from the Dream-Eater, not a roar, but a sick, wet gurgle that seemed to vibrate in the very air. The puppets shuddered and then broke into a shambling charge. The pikes barely had time to react. The first puppet, a mockery of a fallen comrade named Torvik, hurled itself at Hagen. Its mouth hung open, broken jaws swinging wildly, a bubbling hiss escaping its throat. Hagen brought his halberd up with a roar, splitting Torvik's head from crown to collarbone. The puppet collapsed, twitching madly, but the wyrdstone shards embedded in its chest throbbed violently, vomiting out tendrils of black smoke that wrapped around Hagen's legs, pulling him down. Another puppet, once a lithe, dusk-born priestess, now bloated and twisted beyond recognition, clawed at Jarek. Its fingers were fused into jagged, crystalline claws. Jarek caught its wrist mid-swing, feeling the bone snap under his iron grip, and drove his sword into its gut. Green ichor exploded outward, splashing across his armor and burning through the metal with a vicious hiss. He kicked the creature back into the wall, where it slumped in a spasmodic heap, still reaching weakly for him even as its guts spilled onto the stones. The battle became a nightmare of blood and horror. One pike was overwhelmed, dragged down beneath a swarm of puppets. His screams curdled the air as they tore him apart with jagged, wyrdstone-tipped fingers. His blood sprayed in great arterial jets, splattering the walls in arcs of glistening red. Jarek fought like a man possessed, hacking, slashing, driving his blade into rotted hearts and twisted skulls. Every puppet that fell writhed in death throes that filled the air with choking clouds of green vapor, each breath scraping at his lungs like sandpaper. Above them, the Dream-Eater pulsed and gurgled, its tendrils twitching with each kill, each fresh surge of despair. It seemed to grow stronger, more solid, feeding on their agony. Jarek knew they couldn't win by attrition. They had to strike at the source. "Cut the tendrils," he shouted, voice raw. Hagen heard, dragging himself free of the choking black smoke, and launched himself at a cluster of puppets. With savage swings of his halberd, he severed the thick, writhing cords connecting them to the Dream-Eater. The results were immediate. The puppets shrieked, high, piercing wails of childlike terror, as they collapsed into twitching heaps, their bodies crumbling into dust and shards of wyrdstone. The Dream-Eater recoiled, thrashing against the ceiling, its flesh rippling with waves of rage. Jarek seized the moment. He leapt onto the fallen remains of a puppet, scrambling up the rubble like a cornered beast, and hurled his sword with all the strength left in his battered body. The blade spun end over end through the misty gloom, and buried itself deep into the Dream-Eater's pulsing underbelly. The creature convulsed violently, a soundless scream tearing through the chamber. It tore itself free from the ceiling, crashing down in a thunderous heap, tendrils flailing madly, smashing stone and flesh alike. The survivors fled, battered and bloodied, into the maze beyond, not daring to look back. Behind them, the Dream-Eater bellowed its death throes, the sound a symphony of the city's madness. the last convulsions of a nightmare too vast to truly die. And still, deeper in the earth, the wyrdstone bloom pulsed on, stronger, hungrier, awaiting the final act of ruin. Chapter 14. A Shattered Blade. Morella Shade crouched behind the jagged lip of a collapsed archway, her green eyes glinting in the dim wyrdstone glow that bathed the cavern. Around her, the remnants of her band shifted restlessly, their nerves strung taut as bowstrings. The air was thick with the cloying reek of old death and wyrdstone fumes, a miasma so dense it clung to the skin like oil. Before them, across a field of shattered bones and sunken masonry, lay the wyrdstone bloom. It was immense, a tumor of crystal and raw, seething energy that pulsed like the heart of a dying god. Massive shards of green and black jutted from the ground in jagged spirals, spewing tendrils of vapor that coiled and twisted into obscene shapes. At the bloom's center was a core so bright it was painful to look at, a nucleus of raw corruption that warped the very air around it, making the world shimmer and swim. Morella wrapped her fingers tighter around the shard she had stolen, the wyrdstone fragment that resisted the illusions. Its cold thrum against her palm was the only thing that kept her tethered to sanity. It shielded her mind, kept the worst of the bloom's maddening influence at bay. But it would not be enough. "We go in fast," she whispered to her group. "Strike at the base. Shatter it. Scatter it. If we stay too long—" A low laugh, cruel and mocking, interrupted her. She snapped her head up, scanning the ruins. The laugh had come from the darkness between the bloom's roots. From the smoke and shifting shadows emerged figures. Familiar figures. Morella stared, heart hammering in her chest. The figures were them, perfect mirror images, yet subtly wrong. Their skin was too pale, their smiles too wide, their eyes hollow black pits, seeping threads of green mist. One wore her face, Morella's own crooked grin mocking her, her twin's fingers wrapped around a dagger slick with blood. Another was a grotesque mockery of Bram, her second in command, his neck twisted at an impossible angle but still standing, still grinning. The mirrored copies advanced, weapons ready, their steps perfectly synchronized with the originals. Morella's blood ran cold. "Kill them!" she roared, hurling herself forward. The two sides clashed with a sickening wetness, like butchered meat slapping stone. Morella met her double head-on. Their daggers flashed, twin arcs of gleaming steel. She ducked under a slash aimed for her throat, driving her blade into the doppelganger's side, only for the thing to twist unnaturally, bones cracking, and retaliate with a brutal elbow that sent her staggering back. Across the battlefield, Bram fought his mirror image, each blow met with an identical counter. Their blades clanged and screeched against each other, sparks raining down. Bram howled as his twin sword slipped past his guard, burying itself deep into his thigh with a spray of blood. He retaliated, slamming the pommel of his weapon into the copy's face, caving in the nose with a satisfying crunch. But the thing barely flinched. It was like fighting memories carved from hate. Morella's lungs burned. Every strike she landed on her double seemed to warp the thing, making it more monstrous, more grotesque. Her reflection's flesh split and twisted, tendons snapping free to lash at her like whips, eyes bulging into eyeless sacks of pus. The others fared no better. One of her men, Varn, was dragged screaming into the tendrils of vapor by 3 copies of himself, his body torn apart and reassembled mid-air in a spray of bone and viscera, before being discarded like a broken toy. His scream ended in a wet gurgle that echoed horribly across the cavern. The wyrdstone bloom pulsed faster now, responding to the carnage, feeding on their rage and despair. The walls of the cavern flexed and heaved, the very stones weeping thick black ichor that steamed and bubbled where it touched the ground. Mirella wiped blood from her mouth, feeling a sharp crack in her ribs with every breath. Her double lunged again, too fast, too fluid. But Mirella rolled aside, slashing at the exposed flank. This time, her blade bit deep into the wyrdstone embedded in the creature's heart. The doppelganger froze, its mouth stretching wide in a voiceless scream. Cracks spiderwebbed from the wound, spreading across its body in glowing green fissures. With a final shuddering convulsion, the thing exploded into a storm of shards and gore, drenching Mirella in steaming blood and shards of corrupted crystal. She rose unsteadily to her feet, clutching the shard of weir tighter. "The heart!" she bellowed over the roar of battle. "Strike at the crystal in their chests!" One by one the survivors adapted. Blades found their marks. The false men and women shrieked and burst apart in gory detonations, the green mist thinning, retreating with each kill. But the cost was hideous. Bram fell, a mirrored dagger buried in his throat, his lifeblood spurting from his mouth in rhythmic bursts as he gurgled and collapsed. Finally, only Mirella stood, her armor torn, her body a canvas of bruises and cuts, facing the bloom alone. She limped toward it, every step a labor of will, raising the shard of weird high above her head. The bloom seemed to recoil, the tendrils hissing, lashing out. She plunged the shard into the base of the bloom with all her strength. There was a sound like the world tearing open, a deep, groaning roar that reverberated through the marrow of the earth. The bloom convulsed, the green light within it sputtering, dimming. Cracks split its surface, releasing a howling storm of vapor and noise, a chorus of the dead and damned screeching their fury. The bloom did not die, but it was wounded. Mirella fell to her knees, coughing blood, the shard still embedded deep into the heart of the wyrdstone monstrosity. Around her, the cavern shook violently, stone collapsing from the ceiling, splitting the floor open into bottomless black chasms. She had heard it, but the bloom was not finished, and as the darkness rushed to swallow her, Mirella knew that the real nightmare was yet to come. Chapter 15. The Price of Sanity. The world had cracked. Mirella's scream was lost in the cacophony as the wyrdstone bloom convulsed, vomiting green fire and thick clouds of choking ash. The wounded bloom's shriek rippled outward, slamming into the minds of every living thing within the cavern and beyond, a psychic blow that shattered the last trembling barriers of sanity. Jarek Varn staggered to his knees, blood dribbling from his ears, eyes squeezed shut against the onslaught. Around him, what few remained of his greypikes writhed on the ground like men caught in a net of burning wire, their mouths gaping in silent screams. Hagen clutched at his head, bloodied fingers clawing deep furrows into his scalp. Affiliations came in tidal waves, faster, stronger, inevitable. The walls twisted into endless corridors filled with dead friends and forgotten oaths. The air shimmered with phantoms, whispering accusations in 1,000 hated voices. Faces, his brother Alaric's face, Mirella's face, his own, grinned from every shattered stone. Reality fractured. The survivors were drowning in it. And then came the voice, not from the bloom, not from the cavern, but from somewhere deeper, older. Memory is the weight that binds you. The words echoed inside their skulls, a voice dry and brittle as dead leaves, a voice without forgiveness or pity. If you wish to stand against the dream, you must pay the toll. Give to me what you hold most dear, and be free. Jarek gasped, the taste of iron thick on his tongue. Around him the others looked up, eyes wide, empty. They were beyond reason now, hovering on the knife's edge of madness. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth. The wyrdstone fed on memory, on the echoes of who they were. Their fears, their guilt, their dreams. It wore them like skin, twisted them into weapons against themselves. It would never stop unless they cut away the roots, unless they gave it what it demanded. One memory, one irreplaceable piece of themselves. The sacrifice. Mirella, bloodied and half-conscious, dragged herself to her feet. Her fingers were broken, her left arm hung limp, but her eyes still burned with feral fire. "I'll do it," she croaked, voice raw. She staggered forward, clutching the embedded shard of weird still vibrating at the bloom's base. Her teeth ground together so hard a molar cracked in her mouth. She closed her eyes and let go. Mirella gave up the memory of her mother, the woman's face, the scent of her hair, the softness of her lullabies, the rough calluses of hands that had worked themselves raw to feed a child, vanished in an instant, ripped from her soul like meat torn from a bone. The pain was white-hot, searing through her mind, leaving a gaping hole where love had once anchored her. She collapsed to her knees, retching, tears streaming down her face from eyes that no longer remembered why she wept. Around her the bloom faltered, shuddering, its green fire dimming slightly. The others saw and understood. One by one, they approached. Hagen stood trembling for a long moment before he clenched his jaw and bowed his head. He gave up the memory of his wife, their wedding day under the golden summer sky, the way her laughter had lit up the dark corners of his heart, all of it wrenched away, devoured. He sagged under the weight of sudden loss, his halberd clattering from nerveless fingers. Another pike followed, offering up the memory of his firstborn son, the boy's first stumbling steps, the way his tiny hand had wrapped around a calloused finger. And tears flowed freely now, not from remembered sorrow, but from the pain of absence, from the bleeding hollowness left behind. Jarek was the lad. He staggered forward, sword dragging behind him, every muscle screaming to resist. He thought of Alaric, of their shared childhood, of nights spent lying under the stars whispering dreams of heroism and glory. He thought of the grave he had dug with his own hands. No, he thought, not that. Never that. But the wyrdstone demanded blood. He fell to his knees, head bowed. "I give in," he whispered. "My memory of why I ever picked up a sword." The moment he spoke, something tore free from his chest. A scream burst from his throat, animal and broken. He remembered standing in the training fields, his father's rough bark of approval, the pride swelling in his young heart. And then he didn't. The memory was gone, a hollow echo where once it had burned bright. He no longer knew why he had chosen this life, why he had fought, bled, killed. Only survival remained. The bloom shuddered again, a shriek of thwarted hunger echoing through the cavern. The illusions cracked and bled away, the ghostly corridors fading into mist. The faces melted from the walls. The whispers died. The survivors, battered and broken, stood in the ruin of themselves, surrounded by the echoes of 1,000 forgotten dreams. They had won a moment of clarity, but at a terrible cost. They no longer remembered what had brought them to Mordheim. They no longer remembered what they had loved. They were hollowed-out shells driven only by instinct, by the primal need to endure. And in the black heart of the earth, the wyrdstone bloom pulsed once more, slower now, weaker, but not dead, not yet. Chapter 16. A Traitor's Crown. The aftermath of the offering left the survivors hollow, walking corpses with bloodied hands and blank, empty stares. They moved without purpose, without memory, their souls' ragged banners shredded by the wyrdstone's cruelty. Only the deep instinct to press forward remained, an animal urge as unthinking as breath or bleeding. Jarek Varn stumbled through the wreckage of the bloom's cavern, his sword dragging behind him, the point screeching across broken stone. Hagen and the few remaining pikes limped after him, faces gaunt, their armor cracked and blackened by smoke and ichor. Mirella leaned heavily against a shattered pillar, her breath wheezing through cracked ribs, the shard of weird pulsing weakly in her blood-slick hands. It was then that he spoke. Davin Krall, a pike of little note before the madness, a man known more for his stubbornness and sullen resentment than for valor, stepped forward from the shadows. There was a strange light in his sunken eyes now, a fevered gleam that spoke of dreams too grand and too rotten to be real. "The bloom is weak," he croaked, his voice scraping like rusted iron. "The time has come for a new order." The others turned slowly, sluggishly, like beasts woken from uneasy sleep. Krall stood atop a mound of corpses, wyrdstone shards embedded in the exposed bone and shredded meat at his feet. His armor was a patchwork of stolen plates, his shield gone, replaced by a broken mirror lashed to his forearm. Around his brow he had fastened a crude crown, a twisted circlet of wyrdstone shards bound together by gut and wire, pulsing faintly with a sick green light. "I am the Dream King," he declared, spreading his arms wide. "The master of this place, the heir to Mordheim's endless night." The surviving pikes and broken stragglers, dusk-born cultists, rogue mercenaries, scavengers, watched him with dull, empty eyes. The wyrdstone's whispers slithered in their hollow minds, filling the vacuum left by their sacrifices. So, obey. Extreme. One by one they knelt. Mirella snarled in defiance, pushing off the pillar and limping toward Krall, dagger drawn. But one of the kneelers, a pike whose name she had long since forgotten, lunged at her, smashing her to the ground with a savage blow from the butt of a broken spear. Blood filled her mouth. Stars burst behind her eyes. Jarek, swaying on his feet, tried to step forward, but another of the new faithful grabbed him, wrenching his arms behind his back. He struggled weakly, dazed, disoriented. Krall descended from his mound like a conquering god, dragging a ragged pike behind him. He approached Jarek, staring into his former captain's eyes with a mixture of pity and triumph. "You are relics," he said softly. "Dust and rust. The bloom has shown me the truth. We are not meant to resist. We are meant to become." He turned to the assembled throng. "Shamor Musko. They will build my kingdom," he cried. "Their hands will shape my throne. Their blood will water my gardens. Their dreams will feed me until the end of all things." A roar of hollow cheers rose from the gathered rabble, an echoing, soulless chant that reverberated off the shattered walls. "Dream King. Dream King. Dream King." Krall raised his pike high, and the wyrdstone crown flared brighter, the shards trembling with barely contained power. Tendrils of green energy seeped from the cracks in the stone, slithering across the floor, binding the worshippers together in an invisible web. Mirella forced herself upright, wiping blood from her broken mouth. She locked eyes with Jarek across the chaos, a moment of shared understanding, raw and silent. They had faced illusions before. They had faced nightmares and phantoms. But this was flesh and blood. Madness made manifest in a man who had once been their own. Krall turned back to them, pike lowered to point at Jarek's heart. "Kneel," he commanded, voice vibrating with wyrdstone power. Jarek straightened as much as he could against the arms pinning him, blood trickling from his lip. "No." The word was a whisper, but it carried weight. Krall's mouth twisted into a grimace of disappointment. He nodded once, almost sadly. "So be it." He thrust the pike forward. The tip plunged into Jarek's side, just above the hip, punching through the battered armor and sinking deep into flesh. Pain exploded through Jarek's body, white-hot and searing. He gasped, sagging against his captors, but did not cry out. The crowd roared approval. Morella shrieked in rage, flinging her dagger with all the strength she had left. It spun end over end and struck one of the kneelers instead, burying itself deep into a faithful's throat. Blood fountained out, splashing those nearest in hot red arcs. The Dream King roared in fury. "Seize her! Break her bones!" The faithful surged toward Morella, a tidal wave of broken men and women, their faces slack and dead-eyed. She stumbled backward, but there were too many, and she was too weak. Still, she smiled. It was a wolf smile, a promise of future blood. The wyrdstone crown flared again, brighter now, the cavern shuddering under its unnatural pulse. The Dream King ascended the corpse mound once more, his arms spread wide, his followers closing ranks around him. The old Mordheim had fallen. Now, under the wyrdstone's green and baleful gaze, a new kingdom was rising, and its king was mad. Chapter 17. Battle Beneath the Moon. The Undercity trembled as Morrslieb, the green chaos moon, swelled to its fullest in the night sky above Mordheim. Its baleful light seeped through cracks and shattered ceilings, bleeding into the black depths like a sickly tide. Beneath its glare, reality itself thinned, and the dead city seemed to pulse with a fevered heartbeat, faster, faster, in time with the wyrdstone's unholy rhythm. The Dream King's army gathered beneath the ruined vaults, a shambling horde of the broken, the brainwashed, and the damned. Men whose eyes glowed with green fire, women whose arms were crusted with jagged shards of wyrdstone, children with hollow smiles, clutching butcher's knives and rusted swords. All of them knelt beneath the great fissure overhead, where the raw emerald gaze of Morrslieb peered down like an accusing god. Davin Kroll, once a grey pike, now crowned in madness, stood atop a platform of broken stone and bone. The wyrdstone circlet fused into the flesh of his scalp. The pulsing bloom behind him throbbed like a cancerous heart, its tendrils lashing hungrily at the ruins. Before him, in the stinking dark, stood the last few who remembered sanity. Jarek Varn, a ragged figure leaning heavily on his sword, his armor cracked and blackened, his body stitched together with sheer will. Morella Shade, her mouth twisted into a grim smile, the shard of word clenched in her mangled hand. Hagen, bleeding from a dozen wounds, face grim and set. Only a handful of others survived beside them, half-ghosts, bearing the ruin of battle and betrayal in every broken step. There was no speech, no rallying cry, only the understanding that if they did not fight now, Mordheim's soul would be devoured whole. The Dream King raised his pike high. "Kneel or perish," he roared, his voice rolling like thunder through the vaults. In answer, Jarek spat blood onto the stones. The Dream King shrieked in fury, and the two forces collided, with the sound of shattering bone and tearing flesh. Jarek met the charge head-on, his sword swinging in wide, brutal arcs. His first blow split a zealot's face from brow to chin, a geyser of blood erupting as the corpse toppled. He pivoted, ripping his blade free and driving it into the gut of a second foe, twisting hard before tearing it out in a spray of gore. Hagen stood like a wall of iron, his halberd sweeping through the faithful like a scythe through wheat. One blow decapitated two, the next hacked through a shoulder, leaving a faithful follower screaming and twitching in the dirt. His face was a mask of blood and mud, his teeth bared in a rictus snarl. Morella fought with speed and precision, weaving through the enemy ranks like a viper, her dagger opening throats and bellies with flickering stabs. She wielded the shard of weird in her other hand like a beacon, its pale glow burning away illusions, revealing the twisted, rotting souls behind the dream-drunk faces. The enemy was endless. They came in waves, howling, shrieking, foaming at the mouth, trampling their own dead to reach the last sane men and women of Mordheim. Jarek felt his strength ebbing, his breath ragged, his muscles burning with each desperate swing. A boy barely older than 15 rushed him, a jagged spear trembling in his hands. Jarek hesitated for half a heartbeat, but only half. His sword punched through the boy's chest, the impact jarring his arms to the bone. The boy's mouth worked silently, blood bubbling over his lips, before he slumped off the blade. Jarek staggered backward, heart hammering, bile rising in his throat. There was no innocence here, only madness. Above them, Morrslieb's green eyes seemed to widen, and the wyrdstone bloom answered. The cavern shuddered as fresh tendrils erupted from the ground, whipping through the ranks of the faithful, binding them tighter in the Dream King's will. Kroll strode through the chaos untouched, his broken pike held aloft. His followers fell around him, but he marched on, eyes locked on Jarek with burning hatred. "You are a relic," he bellowed, "a dying echo of a world already rotted away. Bow to the new dream, brother." Jarek said nothing. His arms were trembling, his body screaming for rest, but his feet remained planted. Marilla surged beside him, her mouth twisted in a fierce grin. We end this," she spat. The last survivors formed a tight circle, back to back, facing the storm. The Dream King screamed, a sound of pure madness, and hurled himself into the fray. The final battle was chaos. Jarek and Kroll clashed in a storm of steel and blood. Kroll's pike slashed deep across Jarek's ribs, a burning line of agony. But Jarek answered with a savage riposte, driving his sword into Kroll's thigh and wrenching it free in a spray of blackened blood. Marilla danced around the Dream King's faithful, her blade a blur, each stab another prayer to survival. Hagen fought like a dying titan, swinging his halberd in desperate, brutal arcs, even as wounds opened across his arms, his legs, his chest. For every one they slew, 2 more rushed in, teeth gnashing, blades flashing. Blood painted the stones, limbs and corpses piled higher. Jarek grappled Kroll, the 2 men locked in a savage embrace, teeth bared inches from one another's faces. Kroll's breath stank of wyrdstone rot, his eyes burning with green fire. "You could have ruled beside me," Kroll hissed. Jarek headbutted him, feeling the satisfying crack of cartilage and bone. "I was never meant to rule," he rasped, "only to bury kings like you." With a final roar, Jarek drove his sword up, under the wyrdstone crown, into Kroll's skull. The blade punched through brain and bone with a sickening crunch. The Dream King spasmed once, twice, and then collapsed, his crown clattering to the stones, hissing and burning where it touched. A wave of shock rippled through the horde. Their chants faltered, their eyes dimmed. Some clutched their heads, howling in confusion. Others simply dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, weeping without knowing why. The wyrdstone bloom pulsed once, twice, then dimmed, its light flickering like a dying star. The battle was over. The survivors stood amid a sea of dead and broken bodies, breathing hard, blood dripping from their weapons, their armor, their hands. They were few, they were broken, but they were still themselves. Above, Morrslieb loomed, full and terrible, its green light bleeding into the ruins of Mordheim like a promise of more horrors yet to come. And beneath that sickly sky, Jarek Varn, Morella Shade, and a handful of others began the slow, painful climb toward the final reckoning. Chapter 18. Sundering the Wyrdstone. The cavern beyond the battlefield opened up like the gaping maw of a corpse, immense, stinking, and rotten to the bone. Its ceiling was lost in darkness, the air heavy with spores and writhing mist that clung to the skin and burrowed into the lungs. In the center, rising from a pit of molten green ichor, stood the heart of the wyrdstone bloom. It towered like a monument to blasphemy. The central shard was massive, a jagged monolith of corrupted crystal, veins of black wyrdstone twisting within it like worms in carrion. It pulsed with sickly light, each beat sending shockwaves through the ruined undercity, causing the stones to groan and weep. All the suffering, all the bloodshed, had fed this obscene heart, growing it into something that throbbed with a life of its own. And it was not alone. The Dream-Eater awaited them. It had grown monstrous beyond imagining. No longer a slithering parasite, it had unfurled its true form, a towering mass of slick, translucent flesh bristling with bone and shattered armor. Limbs sprouted from its bloated torso like tumors, some ending in clawed hands, others in jagged blades of fused wyrdstone and bone. Its head was a vertical maw lined with concentric rings of needle teeth, framed by twitching flayed wings that leaked viscous black fluid onto the stones below. It was waiting, tethered to the wyrdstone heart by pulsating tendrils that sank deep into its mass, feeding it, binding it. Jarek Varn, Mirella Shade, Hagen, and what few survivors remained stood at the threshold, their weapons slick with blood and ruin, their armor shattered, and their bodies stitched together with little more than rage and defiance. No illusions clouded their minds now, no dreams, no promises. Only death. "This is it," Jarek rasped, voice raw from smoke and blood. "We end it, or it ends everything." Mirella nodded, her battered face set in a grim mask. She still clutched the shard of wyrd, its dim glow the only pure light in the cavern. They moved as one, launching their final, suicidal assault. The Dream-Eater responded instantly. It hurled itself forward with a shriek that shattered stone and ruptured eardrums. Its tendrils lashed out like living whips, seizing one of the survivors, a boy too young to bear a sword, and yanking him into the maw. The creature bit down with a crunch of pulverized bone, devouring him in a single horrific gulp. The others charged. Hagen roared a defiant cry, swinging his halberd in brutal, sweeping arcs. He hacked through the nearest tendrils, black ichor spraying across his armor, burning through the metal with acidic sizzles. A tendril caught his leg and wrenched him off his feet, but he drove his weapon into the flesh of the Dream-Eater, gouging deep. Jarek ducked a lashing appendage, rolling across the blood-slick stones, and drove his sword into the base of a thrashing limb. The blade buried itself to the hilt, and the limb spasmed wildly before tearing itself free with a nauseating rip. Mirella ran like a ghost through the chaos, weaving between the writhing tendrils, the shard of wyrd held high. Her destination was the Bloom's heart, the source of the Dream-Eater's strength. The wyrdstone shard responded to her approach. Tendrils snapped toward her, screaming through the air. She dodged the first, leapt over the second, but the third struck her square in the ribs, sending her sprawling across the stones. Pain exploded through her side. She felt something give, a rib snapping like dry wood. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself up. Hagen saw her stagger and flung himself between her and the Dream-Eater, taking a blow meant for her. The tendril impaled him through the abdomen, lifting him from the ground. Blood poured from his mouth as he roared his last defiance. With a final convulsive heave, Hagen drove his halberd into the Dream-Eater's throat. The weapon shattered, but the creature recoiled, howling in agony, flailing wildly. It was the opening Mirella needed. She sprinted the last few steps to the base of the bloom, the shard of wyrd blazing in her hand. Jarek covered her, carving a bloody path through the surviving tendrils, every swing of his sword a prayer of desperation. His body was failing, his vision swimming, but he fought on. Each heartbeat, a battle won. Mirella reached the core. She raised the shard above her head. The wyrdstone heart pulsed violently, tendrils writhing in a frenzy, the cavern shaking as if the earth itself sought to vomit them out. The the Dream-Eater hurled itself toward her, an avalanche of flesh and rage. He drove the shard down. The moment it struck the bloom's heart, the world screamed. The wyrdstone exploded inward, collapsing upon itself with a detonation of green fire and raw, unformed madness. The Dream-Eater was caught mid-lunge, its flesh unraveling like cloth in a hurricane, its limbs disintegrating into clouds of black ash and writhing shadows. Morella was hurled backward, her body slamming into the stones with bone-shattering force. The shard was gone, vaporized in the blast, its final act complete. Jarek was flung hard against a shattered wall, the breath knocked from his lungs, his vision fading into blackness. The cavern collapsed around them, stones raining down, the wyrdstone glow dying in sputtering flashes. Screams, roars, and the shriek of rending earth filled the air. And then silence. The wyrdstone bloom was dead. The Dream-Eater was no more. But so too were most of the survivors. Their bodies lay broken in the rubble, their blood soaking into the stones, feeding the hungry soil of Mordheim one last time. Only a few still drew breath, clinging to life by a thread. Beneath the ruins of the city, beneath Morrslieb's leering green gaze, they lay in the ashes of madness, the taste of death thick on their tongues. The nightmare was over. For now. Chapter 19. Fractured Dawn. The ruin of the wyrdstone bloom smoldered at the heart of Mordheim's undercity. A festering wound ripped open and cauterized in the same breath. Where once a monstrous growth had pulsed with the sickly heartbeat of madness, there was now only a charred pit, its jagged edges sagging inward like the mouth of a corpse. The cavern was choked with dust and ash. The air, once thick with the electric tang of wyrdstone vapors, was now heavy and still, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The green fire of Morrslieb's light filtered through cracks high above, painting the devastation in a sickly pallor, revealing the broken remnants of a battle that had devoured everything. Bodies littered the ground in tangled heaps. Friend and foe, faithful and sane, all alike now in death. Blood had dried into dark, crusted patches. Severed limbs jutted from rubble like grotesque sculptures. The stench of charred meat hung over the pit like a funeral shroud. From the wreckage, a few figures stirred. Jarek Varn clawed his way out from beneath a slab of broken stone, his hands bleeding, nails cracked and torn. His armor was shattered, his sword gone, his body a latticework of bruises, burns, and gaping wounds. Blood seeped from his mouth as he dragged himself upright against a broken pillar, breathing in ragged, rasping gasps. He blinked into the thick air, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. It was over. They had won. At a cost no sane man could have accepted. Nearby, Morella Shade lay sprawled amid the debris, her left leg twisted at an unnatural angle, her ribs rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Her face was almost unrecognizable, smeared with blood, one eye swollen shut, but the faint, defiant flicker of life still clung to her like a stubborn flame. She had shattered the bloom with the shot of Weird. She had broken the Dream-Eater's spine. And yet, as she opened her remaining eye and met Jarek's hollow stare, it was clear neither of them truly understood what they had bought with that victory. Around them, others moved, or tried to. Hagen was gone, his body half buried in rubble, his face frozen in a rictus of defiance even in death. His shattered halberd lay clutched in his bloody hands, as if he had fought the collapse itself with the last strength of his soul. A few others had survived, men and women Jarek barely recognized, their faces slack with exhaustion and trauma, their movements slow and fumbling, like beasts struggling to comprehend the loss of the world around them. But none were whole. They were shadows of what they had been, their minds carved hollow by the wyrdstone's feasting. Memories bled from them like smoke from a dying fire. Names, faces, reasons for fighting, all slipping away, leaving only jagged fragments of rage, sorrow, and aching emptiness. Jarek tried to speak, but no words came. What could he say? That they had survived? That survival mattered when the essence of who they were had been stripped away, leaving only the shell? That alliances meant anything when they could no longer even recall why they had formed them? He staggered forward, picking his way through the ruins, feeling like a ghost haunting his own corpse. Morella rose to one knee, gritting her teeth against the pain, her dagger clenched tightly in her good hand. She watched Jarek, suspicion flickering across her blood-stained features. No trust remained. The wyrdstone had devoured it. It had devoured everything. One of the other survivors, a man named Gurn, though Jarek barely remembered the name, limped into view, clutching a broken axe. His eyes were wild, darting from shadow to shadow as if expecting betrayal at any moment. He snarled when he saw Jarek, baring broken teeth like a cornered animal. Mirella stepped back instinctively, dagger raised, her breathing ragged. The fragile alliance that had been born of necessity now hung by a thread as thin and brittle as a spider's web in a storm. They stood there in the ruined cavern, bloodied and broken, staring at each other, uncertain whether they were still comrades or merely the next threats to be eliminated. Above, Morrslieb's green light shifted, bathing the ruins in a new shade of wrath. It was a dawn of sorts. A fractured, poisoned dawn. In the stillness that followed, Jarek understood what they had truly won. Not peace, not hope, only the right to crawl away from the wreckage, hollow and haunted, carrying the scars of a nightmare that would never fully fade. Mordheim had claimed them, and it would never let them go. Chapter 20. Echoes of a Nightmare. The ruins of Mordheim slumbered under the noxious gaze of Morrslieb, the green moon fat and leering in the perpetual twilight. The city's carcass rotted in silence, its skeletal towers leaning like drunkards, its streets clogged with rubble, ash, and bone. Wind whistled through broken windows and collapsed temples, carrying with it the faint, fetid stink of wyrdstone dust and old blood. The cataclysm that had shattered the Undercity was already slipping from the minds of those who scrabbled for survival amid the filth. The living remembered little, and what memories remained were corrupted, distorted by fear, by time, and by the whispering breath of the wyrdstone still lingering deep below. They remembered that something had happened, yes. A great violence, a rupture of sanity itself. Warbands that had once fought shoulder to shoulder had turned on each other like starving beasts. Men and women who had once clung to the hope of salvation or power were now nothing more than shattered bodies under collapsed ceilings. But the why was gone. Erased. Conveniently forgotten by those too afraid to pull back the veil and stare into the abyss. Easier to blame the chaos of Mordheim, the eternal hunger of wyrdstone, the cruelty of the gods, failure to let it fester and rot beneath the streets. In the crumbling ruins above, new scavengers prowled, mercenaries, cultists, beastmen, and worse. They spoke in hushed tones of the midsummer's nightmare, of the night the Undercity shook with screams and the moon wept green fire. They spoke of warbands vanishing into the earth, never to return, and of twisted, half-living things that sometimes crawled up through the sewers, shrieking of kings and crowns and dreams. They warned each other to stay clear of certain tunnels, where the very stones bled when touched, and ghostly echoes of battle rattled the walls. They spoke of a queen of shadows, a king of broken dreams, and a shard of cursed wyrdstone that could still be found if one was desperate or foolish enough to seek it. No one spoke of Jarek Varnd, or Mirella Shot, or the dead Dream King. Their names had bled away, just another layer of dust settling over Mordheim's endless grave. Yet in the deepest places, where the city's wounds still festered, the echoes remain. Sometimes, on nights when Morrslieb swelled and the wyrdstone fumes curled like ghostly fingers through the streets, the echoes rose, moaning through the cracks, whispering through the rubble, half-heard snatches of old screams, the wet scrape of blade on bone, the gurgling laughter of the Dream-Eater. In the ruined cathedral where the bloom had first erupted, the stones still pulsed faintly under the right moonlight, veins of black wyrdstone twitching like a heartbeat. In the flooded vaults, reflections flickered and danced on stagnant water, sometimes showing not the ruined world above, but another place, another Mordheim, one twisted and alive with nightmare. And in the labyrinthine tunnels below, where no sane man dared tread, the wyrdstone spores grew thick as mist. Shapes moved within it, broken things that once might have been men, now little more than memories stitched to bone and hunger. They wandered endlessly, mouths working in silent prayers to a king whose name they no longer remembered, toward a throne long since ground to dust. A warning, unheeded. The cycle, unbroken. Mordheim itself was not dead. It dreamed. He wound his hand through the woman's. They hungered, and someday, when enough blood had soaked into its shattered stones, when enough desperate souls had clawed through its cursed streets, the dream would awaken once more. And midsummer's nightmare would rise again, and the city of the damned would feast anew.